Okay. So we all know the story of Woodstock. We know about the couple in the blanket, we know who played and when, we know about the rain and the festival running egregiously late, so late that they ended with a 4th day of a 3-day festival just so the headlining act of the whole damn thing could play. We know about the traffic jam and the helicopters, we know Bob Dylan was a rumored surprise guest. Seeing as he lived just outside Woodstock at the time, it wasn't entirely out of the question. But surprise, surprise, our favorite Gemini drama queen didn't show up. He held out on making his grand return to the stage until Isle of Wight a couple weeks later. Not many people know about the spontaneous mini-festival of local musicians that took place in Back, or that Jeff Beck broke up his band so he wouldn't have to play Woodstock, or about Iron Butterfly getting stuck at the airport, but you know now. Just as Woodstock made Joe Cocker a superstar overnight, a lackluster showing by the ISB on day 2 just about killed their career. And we know Neil Young was weird about being filmed, so why are we here? Hi, I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and this is a very special episode of Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If deep dives aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. Really quickly, before I get into what is sure to be a mega episode, I have no idea what kind of runtime I'm working with today. The new episode of the Dolls podcast is up now. I wrote this episode about Rita Coolidge. Famed for her connections to Leon Russell, Delaney and Bonnie and Friends, Joe Cocker, CSN, Chris Christopherson, and yes, but she's so much more than even all of that. She's such a cool lady, and Emma and I were so excited to tell her story on this episode. Apple and Spotify are, as always, linked in the description. With just 3 episodes left until the Vinyl Monday Season 3 finale, can we just take a pause and appreciate that somehow we've almost made it through 3 years of this nonsense? And with a very special anniversary coming this weekend, I've decided to revive this channel's first mini-series. For the next 3 weeks, I'll be examining the cultural impact of the most important music festival ever held. From August 15th to 18th, 1969 in Bethel, New York, if there were ever a grand finale to the happy hippie 60s, it was this. What better way to kick off our 3 weeks of peace and love than review the film and soundtrack made out of that original 3 days of peace and music. This week's album is Woodstock, music from the original soundtrack, and more. Congrats if you guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what next week's album is gonna be. I host polls where sometimes you get to pick what's on the show. I make announcements when I'm places that aren't here, like my podcast. You can find all of that on my channel. Alright, let's take the plastic off. For the second week in a row now, we have one of those pesky albums designed for automatic turntables. Boo. Boo. But since we're working with a triple album this week, yeah, it's even worse. Sides 1 and 6 are on disc 1, and sides 2 and 5 on disc 2. Thank God 3 and 4 wound up on the same disc, or else I'd probably lose my mind. Being a 3-disc compilation of music, the question of packaging came up, but thanks to The Who's Tommy, manufacturers knew a trifold album jacket would be possible. Fragile? Yes, both my copy of Tommy and Woodstock, the covers are hanging on by a thread, but it is possible. Manufacturers just added a 3rd envelope to the design, and here you go. This is one of the very few albums I've ever found on Facebook Marketplace. That's really all I have to say. If you recognize this handwriting, and you know who Charlie might be, or if you have an album with this handwriting on it, please contact me. Though my copy was christened with Charlie's name, and if you squint really hard, There's a ring from a cup there too. That will not stop me from talking about the Woodstock soundtrack's cover art, captured by Bert Uzzell. The photo that graces the cover of the Woodstock soundtrack is one of the most iconic shots of the 1960s. This young couple wrapped up in the quilt was Nick and Bobbi Ercoline. He, a college student bartending to pay tuition, and she, a bank teller. They were both 20 years old at the time, only dating for a few months when they drove out to Woodstock that fateful weekend. They had no idea the photo was taken until it appeared first in New York Magazine, then on this cover, and even then they wouldn't come forward for another 19 years. In that time, they settled down in New York State, had 2 kids, Bobbi became a school teacher and Nick a carpenter. They were married for 52 years. Sadly, Bobbi passed in October of last year. Another very famous Woodstock couple is Judy and Jerry Griffin. This photo was taken just 2 days after they met. They're still together to this day. Appearing on the Woodstock soundtrack are quite a few recurring characters in the Vinyl Monday verse, like Crosby, Stills and Nash featuring Neil Young, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Sly and the Family Stone, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and Jimi Hendrix with his brand new...
Sure, it's nothing but a band of gypsies.
And we have so many groups that I somehow haven't mentioned on the series until now. Alright, we have Canned Heat, Richie Havens, 2 separate appearances by Country Joe, one with the Fish, Arlo Guthrie, Sha Na Na, Joan Baez with special guest Jeffrey Shirtliff, Joe Cocker, Santana, John B. Sebastian, and Alvin Lee and Company, 10 years after. We also hear announcements by Chip Munk, Hugh Romney, John Morris, and Max Yasgur, who of course own the farm Woodstock took place on. The Woodstock soundtrack was produced by Eric Blackstead, engineered by Eddie Kramer and Lee Osborne. Roll transition. Alright, so just about everyone who's played Woodstock has had their respective sets released as their own live albums. So what the hell am I trying to do with this video? Clearly, I was not alive in 1969. Hell, my mother wasn't even alive when Woodstock took place. She wouldn't be born for another 2 weeks. And though there were a lot of people at Woodstock, like a lot of people at Woodstock, most of the people who were alive in 1969 were not at Woodstock. We know the story of the festival well and good. It's all certified rock and roll mythology at this point. But I have the film soundtrack. So, let's talk about the film. Not unlike the festival itself, it is a miracle the film ever happened. For starters, Michael Lang and Artie Kornfeld didn't even think to film Woodstock until a few days before the shindig was set to begin. The boys called up Michael Wadleigh, who, besides following Nixon on the campaign trail, only had a couple low-budget films to his name. On little more than a hunch that this was gonna be huge, Wadleigh brings out a small army of cameramen consisting of whichever buddies from film school who were free that weekend. From the manager of the stage film crew, quote, "Wadleigh and I were already feeling nostalgic about the pioneer rockers of the 1950s. Fats Domino, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, whose work was no longer being played very much. We got the idea of staging a concert featuring them and their music, which we would film. Then we began hearing rumors about the Woodstock concert. It soon became clear that this was going to include probably the greatest gathering of popular musicians ever assembled. So they pivoted. And upstate they went. Neil Young's touring engineer, L.A. Johnson, was recruited to record the sound. Production just barely secured funding from John Calley at Warner Brothers. He gave them $15,000, which would be just over $128,000 in today's money. Michael knew going in that this was gonna be a steep operation. Not only did they have to capture what was going on stage, they had to capture what was going on in the crowd, which original estimates placed at being between 30 and 50,000. Oh boy! The 7-man camera crew assigned to the stage was directed by Richie Chu and Marty. Marty was straight up having a bad time. This was his first major documentary shoot, and he was getting rained on, covered in mud, and trapped under the tent he slept in. They were supposed to communicate through headsets, but I guess no one thought of how loud it would be right in front of the amps. It didn't take long at all before they gave up on the headsets and just, quote, winged it. Meanwhile, Thelma Schumacher is stuck up in the booth pleading with lighting designer Chip Monk to brighten up the stage. It was a weekend-long battle, the footage still turns out pretty dark, even now I have to brighten it up to show you. The rest of the cameramen set off in different directions around the grounds, backstage, through the crowd, all the way out to the road to get the traffic jam. They even stuck a couple guys in helicopters. Traffic and weather may have paused the festival, but it did not delay filming. The guys just kept rolling and rolling on the crowd and subsequently ran out of film. Remember, this is 1969. You can't just swap out an SD card or chuck a few hours of footage on an external hard drive. You have to run back to a central location, get some more film, change it out, and get your ass back out there. Normally, procuring more film wouldn't be too much of an issue. You have a nearby stockist load up a van and drive it in. However, as we know, the traffic jam was about 20 miles long. There was no driving anybody or anything in. So just like the bands, that shit was flown in by helicopter. Even with suppliers across the nation shipping in to keep Woodstock rolling, by day 2, the crew had to be choosy about what they were gonna film. Sometimes that decision would be made for them. See Neil Young, or The Who. After the Abby Hoffman thing, Pete Townsend forced the stage crew to put down their cameras for the rest of the set, but they ignored orders and got We're Not Gonna Take It as the sun rose on day 3. As for the rest, when you give a rock band in 1969 a 5-hour wait to go on, what are they gonna do? Rehearse? Chill out? Stand around eating grapes and picking their wedgies? Hell no! They're gonna get loaded! And what's that band gonna do when they finally get on stage? Yeah, they're gonna throw their set list out the window and play whatever the hell they feel like playing. This made production's job pretty hard. How do you pick and choose what to film if you don't know what these guys are gonna play? Sleeping? Never heard of it. The crew was running off adrenaline and adrenaline alone. And maybe some substances floating around in the crowd. When cameraman Hart Perry was sent out, people would offer him their joints. Back then, you didn't worry about what was in the spliff, you just took a puff to be nice. But Hart should have been worried. He got zooted beyond this mortal plane. Poor guy was reduced to crawling around on the ground. Just 24 hours in and the crew were worse for wear. Thank God someone had the sense to call in a doctor. Richie Chu vowed to, quote, never listen to rock music again if he survived. Miraculously, the Woodstock production crew did survive. They came out the other side with about 70 hours of usable raw footage. And that's just the usable stuff. The whole weekend reportedly produced 120 miles. How much was synced to the sound? Exactly none of it. It took Michael, Thelma, and her fellow editors 2 months to scrub through all the footage, painstakingly looking for visual cues, if there were any to be found in the first place. As for the soundtrack, the brunt force of what we hear here came from 64 reels of multi-track tape recorded across 3 near non-stop 18-hour sessions. As stated by producer Eric Blackstead in the liner notes, it was a, quote, challenge of unprecedented scope and complexity, requiring a level of endurance from both man and machine previously unheard of in on-location recording. There are several discrepancies between what's in the final film and what appears on this soundtrack. That's because, amidst the rain-soaked brouhaha, no one thought to hand out release forms. I don't even know if there were release forms in the first place. Jerry Wexler was tasked with getting the rights to the recordings. He had to call every single act, and a stone-cold sober manager is gonna be a lot harder to convince than a thoroughly toasted hippie rock band. band. Notably absent are the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin. We do see them towards the beginning of the film, though. Janis played early in the morning on day 3, but was pretty thoroughly inebriated. She didn't like how she sounded and requested she be left out of the original cut of the film. Her estate eased up, though, and she'd appear in all subsequent cuts after the 25th anniversary edition. As for the Grateful Dead, their set was a shit show. They played through the rain, the electrical system at Woodstock was notoriously wonky, see the cables ran through trenches of water, poor Jer Bear and his crew were getting shocked non-stop by their instruments. I wouldn't want that in a movie either. Then we have Albert Grossman, who managed Janis and the band at the time. He decided to make Jerry Wexler's job a whole lot harder. When he caught wind of this rights situation, he saw dollar signs, banding a bunch of his manager buddies together and effectively holding rights to their group's recordings hostage. If Wexler didn't fork over a frankly absurd amount of money, their guys and gals weren't in the film. If I'm not mistaken, the band is the only remaining holdout from this managerial game of chess. Their footage remains in the vault to this day. Several artists were bumped around, both on film and on disc. Joe Cocker originally performed after Jefferson Airplane, but on here he's bumped out to After the Who. Sha Na Na was bumped way out as well. The track listing of Woodstock goes as follows. Opening up disc 1, we have John B. Sebastian with I Had a Dream, followed by Canned Heat with Going Up the Country. We have some stage announcements before Richie Havens playing Freedom, round 1 of Country Joe featuring The Fish with rock and soul music. Then Arlo Guthrie coming into Los Angeles, and closing side 1 is Sha Na Na at the Hop. Opening up side 2, we have Country Joe, by himself this time, with the
What's that spell?
Fish, cheer, and I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die rag. Next, Joan Baez. First, she sings Drugstore Truck Drivin' Man with Jeffrey Shirtliff, then Joe Hill solo. Following some more stage announcements are Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, adding Neil Young for Sea of Madness. Opening up disc 2, we have Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young doing Wooden Ships, and The Who's epic finale, We're Not Gonna Take It. After some more stage announcements is Joe Cocker with a little help from my friends, and side 3 closes out with The Rainstorm. Side 4 also opens with The Rainstorm, and the crowd chanting Then Santana, Soul Sacrifice, and after some more stage announcements, side 4 is closed out with 10 Years After, I'm Going Home. Opening up disc 3 is Jefferson Airplane with Volunteers, and a little appearance by Max Yasgur. Then we have Sly and the Family Stone's medley of Dance to the Music, Music Lover, and I Wanna Take You Higher. Side 5 closes out with John B. Sebastian, Rainbows All Over Your Blues. Opening up side 6, we have the Paul Butterfield Blues Band playing Love March, and closing out the album is Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, followed by a jam on Purple Haze. The Woodstock soundtrack was apparently released in May of 1970, coinciding with the film screening at the Cannes Film Festival. Why it wouldn't come out with the film's box office release date in March, I have no idea. If this May date is true, then both Joni Mitchell's Ladies of the Canyon and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young's Deja Vu would have come out in the months before. Both feature recordings of Joni's song Woodstock. Though she couldn't attend due to scheduling conflicts, she wrote the song about what she imagined the festival to be like. Thankfully, the Woodstock film made back its $600,000 expenses tenfold, grossing about $50 million at the box office. Which would be, hold on to your hats folks, about $400 million today. I know that's nothing like today, where you have phenomena like Barbenheimer grossing over $1 billion, but a box office success like that for a film like this was unheard of in 1970. The cultural impact of the film alone was/is insane, never mind the festival itself. It's won an Oscar, it's been preserved by the Library of Congress as a culturally significant piece of media, even National Lampoon spoofed it. And that Marty kid who directed the stage camera crew, yeah, he went on to be a pretty fucking big deal. Thelma Schumacher has been his partner in crime the whole time, serving as editor on nearly all of Scorsese's films. As for director Michael Wadleigh, he only added 2 films to his resume after this, as cinematographer on the 1974 Janis documentary and director of Wolfen, the only feature film to his name. Looking at Wolfen's reception and box office numbers, yeah, it's no wonder he dipped out from filmmaking after that. While the soundtrack doesn't count as the first triple album that would require it was a studio album and not a soundtrack, that honor would go to All Things Must Pass. This is one of the first triple albums ever made. On to the chapter of this video I have been dreading. Reviewing Woodstock is enough as is, right? But in order to review Woodstock, I must first review Woodstock. It's a tall order to review a 4-hour documentary, especially when it's so entwined with the album at hand. But I'll do my best to keep it short. Like I said in my joint Get It Be, Get Back and Let It Be review. Oh boy, this is gonna be a long day. Like I said there, every documentary has an angle. What is Woodstock's? 50 years after the festival, Michael said this, quote, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland was one of my favorite pieces of poetry, and I was thinking about it at the time. I got out there and started filming that as if it were a war zone, and that's why you see people in casts on their arms and legs and hobbling down in the dirt. I felt like the 60s were ending, and we were going to head into more depressed times, and that a lot of our ideals were not going to work out. Alright, so that's a crock of shit. Forgive me, but I don't exactly pin Michael as the psychic type. Iconic film critic Roger Ebert echoed this sentiment in his 2005 retrospective review, though with a sunnier disposition. Quote, somebody told me the other day that the 1960s has failed. Failed at what? They certainly didn't fail at being the 1960s, now that the period is described as a far ago time like or the 1930s. How touching it is to see the full flower of its movement, of its youth and hope. The decade began with the election of John F. Kennedy and ended as the last bedraggled citizens of Woodstock Nation slogged off the muddy field and thumbed a ride into the future that would seem, to many of them, mostly downhill. Was that how things played out? Yes. Did the hippies fail at their objective? No. Because quite frankly, they didn't have an objective to begin with. They only had the spirit. I'm sorry to say that as powerful as the spirit is, it can make some change. It can't change the world. Woodstock was the last energy eked out of that spirit when the star gets bright before it dies. Things would never be quite this good for the hippies again. What do I think the true angle of Woodstock was? Simple. Do the best they possibly can to capture the chaos, the calamity, and miracle of 3 days of peace and music in just over 3 hours' time. Of course, that's kind of impossible. The 25th anniversary edition, the cut most widely available nowadays, and the one I watched, made an effort to rectify this, bumping the runtime out to 3 hours and 45 minutes. It includes Janis and some more of Canned Heat, Jefferson Airplane, and Jimi's sets. The 40th anniversary cut includes even more. Melanie, CCR, the one Grateful Dead song where they weren't being shocked to hell by their own equipment. I am so so grateful to have Janis in my cut of the film. Even in her less than stellar state, she rocked the place. And she was such a sweetheart, chatting with the audience, making sure they were okay and had water and a place to sleep. I also enjoyed having Canned Heat's jam. It's a much better representation of what they could do than what's on the soundtrack, but I am saving that for the next chapter of this video. Wadleigh and company deliberately excluded artists' big hits from the film. For the most part, I think people would riot if they went to see Woodstock and there was no Jimi Hendrix playing Purple Haze. Here's the thing about the Woodstock film. If you're looking for a play-by-play of Woodstock on stage, this isn't it. It more so captures the mini city that formed on Yasgur's farm that weekend. It's the musicians and it's the people on ground. My cut of Woodstock is about 2 parts music to 1 parts people. Fascinating as these characters are, nuns flashing peace signs, chicks picking flowers, dancing partially nude, motorcycles riding through the dirt. I'd have liked just a smidgen more music. I did find myself getting bored. I just wanted more of the musicians. We see glimpses of Jerry and a girlfriend hanging out.
Marijuana.
Janis arriving, and Richie Havens centering himself before facing a massive crowd. But where are the backstage antics? Keith Moon had to be up to some shit. But I see why the editors kept this ratio. They're not focused on capturing the myth of the musicians, it's the myth of the weekend. And that's what it is, a myth. For Christ's sake, the film opens with people happily wheeling around open fields on tractors and pretty people on ponies. Emphasis on pretty people. I had no idea Michael Lang was hot. The next time you watch this thing, keep those pretty pastoral images in mind as the farm morphs into a city. The rain saturating the ground, footpaths and tire tracks carved into the green grass, garbage in heaps, discarded clothing all over the place. I shudder at the thought of the smell because I know damn well one janitor couldn't keep up with all that literal actual shit. Going back to the editing. The standard editing style for a concert film nowadays is camera up front, cameras to the sides, maybe a long cable for a tracking shot down a runway a la Taylor Swift stage setup, and 1 or 2 cameras in the audience for a split-second reaction shot. Michael Wadleigh had some serious manpower behind this thing, and you can tell. They had so many men and so much film that most of the runtime is spent in split screen. You could watch Woodstock once, only looking at the left, watch it again looking just at the right, and get a totally different film both times. Sometimes it gets the same performer from 2 different angles. Sometimes it sweeps across the band. A reaction shot here, silly commentary there.
What's it gonna be called?
Oh.
It's a very free editing style that I appreciate. It condenses the narrative without feeling disingenuous to the story. Woodstock does take some liberties with the timeline. Joe Cocker does not appear after Jefferson Airplane. That was a disservice to him in his story. His Woodstock experience played out the way it did in part because he had one of the most important bands of the 60s essentially serving as his opening act. Documentary can be a glimpse of life. This definition absolutely applies to Woodstock. We got to see the poor, unsuspecting tourists who dared vacation in the area the weekend of the festival. Kids being kids, dancing, skinny dipping, fucking in the grass. They brought their own kids. They brought their dogs, all nameless, all many, all one. Some of those people have names. Some had bigger names. But the one cameo I can't get out of my head is the janitor. This scene took place just after the grass that I can't show you here for obvious reasons. The Portishead man is humble, trying his best in a futile fight to keep TP in stock. I'm glad to do it for these kids, he says. One of his own kids is somewhere out in the crowd. The other, he reveals, is part of a DMZ unit in Vietnam. A seemingly innocuous moment, but sobering when you think of how the janitor's unseen sons are the 2 archetypes of the 60s. The soldier and the hippie. Most of the off-the-cuff, poetic moments like this take place off-stage.
Blind Faith is a groovy group.
Oh, for the love of God! Personal highlights include a wild-eyed and wild-haired Grace Slick waking a sea of thousands with her morning maniac music introduction. Janis loving on the crowd is great too. Roger Daltrey in all his fringed glory, I just hit myself in the face, getting his second wind after a grueling performance of Tommy. It's like seeing Hercules in the flesh. I got goosebumps. And Joan Baez, 6 months pregnant, setting down her guitar to sing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot a cappella. I'm not a fan of the performance itself. It drags on a little bit for me, but holy hell, it's like Mother Mary suddenly appears on that stage. Since we've gotten into the music, I might as well get into the music. What do I think of Woodstock?
Marijuana! Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome warmly.
Going in, I always knew of Woodstock. It's the defining event of the 1960s, and certainly the zenith of the hippies. Obviously, when I was first getting into the music of the 1960s and 70s, Woodstock was essential. I normally don't brag in these videos. Any showing off I do is with the utmost gratitude to those who made it possible, but boy do I brag about my first experience with the Woodstock material, because it's just about as good as I could get. On the weekend of the 50th anniversary of Woodstock, my mother, my father, and myself drove my sister all the way out to her very first semester of college. To kill time, I popped in my earbuds and listened to all of Woodstock. Rhino's 32 CD box set had just come out. I may or may not have been listening to a pirated stream. I heard almost every song in real time, exactly as it happened 50 years before. I regrettably slept through Sly and the Family Stone. Experiencing the beauty of the American highway system, passing through so many places I'd never seen before and probably will never see again, soundtracked by the zenith of the 60s counterculture, I can confidently say it was one of the most profound and beautiful experiences of my young life. And I feel sorry for those whose first experiences weren't as awesome as mine. Here I am, 5 years later. That weekend was, in a lot of ways, the beginning of the journey you see here now on this channel. Because I didn't just listen to Woodstock, I listened to Joni Mitchell's records, Joan Baez, Led Zeppelin, various Eric Clapton groups. And that weekend was when I first discovered Bob Dylan. Clearly, this won't be the exhaustive, get at it with a fine-toothed comb review you're used to from me. It can't be. This is a triple LP from like 20 different artists that would be a logistical nightmare. So I'll keep it to a few lines per artist with some shine on my personal favorite tunes. Like the film, the Woodstock soundtrack has an angle. Unless we're talking straight up field recordings, there's no such thing as a pure documentary on film or on disc. Gene Scalati says as much in the CD's liner notes. The angle here is to condense and polish up the Woodstock film's vision further. Get it concise enough so a home listener who couldn't haul out to Yasgur's farm and can't rewatch the film endlessly. Remember, this is 1970, streaming doesn't exist, you'd have to go to the theater and pay every single time. It gives them a taste of the Woodstock experience. My big thing with this presentation of Woodstock, it is an overdubbed, over-embellished mess. There's just way too much incidental stuff here. I've seen the film, that's why I own the soundtrack. I don't need the crickets. I don't need every single announcement. I don't need the chant dubbed in after the fact. Yeah, that's right, the chant dubbed in. All of that is supposed to make this album an immersive experience, but it winds up doing the opposite. Especially seeing as I have to get up and change the disc so many damn times. Curse you, automatic record players! My other big thing, holy hell, the band should have been here. Damn you, Albert Grossman, for were ruining everything. They played one of the best sets of the whole weekend. Overall, the first disc is rough, not helped by a paltry opener. I could really do without John B. Sebastian's I Had a Dream. The studio version and the one here, it's just way too saccharine for my taste. Canned Heat, normally a phenomenal group, but oh my God, were they on the struggle bus for this one. Blind Owl's voice was shot, and they were one of many, many groups that fell victim to Woodstock's sound issues. From what I understand, the sound guys couldn't finagle a PA facing the stage so no one could hear themselves. By the time they played Going Up the Country, a song I love for how emblematic of the happy hippie 60s is, the heat had burned off. God bless Richie Havens for playing for 3 hours to keep the crowd occupied while groups were still flying in. He didn't have to play so many encores, but he did, and we don't give him enough credit for keeping the peace. Bad things happen when big crowds get antsy. Just look at Altamont. I didn't know who Richie was before my original Woodstock excursion. He was such an original. There's no one who sounds like him. He's got the voice of an ancient speaker to the gods. That growl came from the 10 Commandments. No one plays like him either. Look at all the wear around his pickguard. How did he get it all the way up there? Freedom is one of the lesser praised miracles of Woodstock. I always just assumed this was an original and a staple in Richie's repertoire because, come on, you'd never know he made this shit up on the fly, jamming on Motherless Child. Freedom sounds ancient, like it's lived in the soil for 1,000 years. Marijuana! Round 1 of Country Joe with rock and soul music. I'm glad this was shortened to 2 minutes for the soundtrack. I always thought the studio version was a tad too long, and they kept my favorite 2 minutes. The James Brown call and response bit really should have happened here. It's the most fun I have listening. My interest wavers through Arlo Guthrie and Sha Na Na. I've never been big into Arlo Guthrie. This coming into Los Angeles isn't even from Woodstock, it's from the Troubadour, so I'm even more inclined to write it off. Those 2 minutes of At the Hop are Round 2 of Country Joe with one of my favorite protest songs of this era, the Fixin' to Die rag.
Listen, people, I don't know how you expect to ever stop the war if you can't sing any better than that. There's about 300,000 of you f***ers out there.
The crowd may not have been vibing with it, but I sure was. 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. It's flippant, it's defiant, it's facing mortality far too young. It's accepting your fate with a middle finger to the air, or otherwise the United States government. Although it took me an embarrassingly long time to get the 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates joke. 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't know.
Good evening, I hope it stops raining.
Oh, you sweet summer child. Then guest singer Jeffrey Shirtliff opens Joan Baez's set with a baffling claim. And I quote, "The draft resistance is different from other movements and revolutions in this country in that we have no enemies." Huh? My buddy, my guy, you do have enemies. I am all for those who dodged the draft. The United States had no business being in Vietnam, and I'm glad that has been generally accepted by now. But dodging the draft will make you an enemy of the United States government. There were a lot of speeches happening on Folk Day, pretty in character. Joan herself makes one about her husband organizing a hunger strike while he was in prison. Damn CBS for censoring Joan's appearance on Smothers Brothers while she talked about her husband's imprisonment. Of the 2 numbers here, I feel like this is the wrong answer, but I prefer Drugstore Truck Driving Man. It's a little heavy-handed lyrically, no reading between the lines to be done here, and reading between the lines is one of my favorite things to do with folk writers. But like Fixin' to Die, I like when the hippies actually put some muscle behind what they're saying. And Joan's voice was always right. She was no victim to any sound issues issues, her ear was impeccable and her voice clear as a bell. On to one of my personal favorite acts on the whole Woodstock bill, CSN and sometimes Y. These guys famously fell victim to sound issues. It's such a shame, but I understand. Harmonizing is hell when you can't hear yourself, let alone each other. Nash hangs on to his parts on Sweet Judy, Blue Eyes, and Wooden Ships by a thread, but Cross is fighting for his life. I hate to say this, but you can tell this was only their second gig ever. This was a huge cultural moment they couldn't have missed, but they were under-rehearsed. Neil Young. Ugh. I love him to pieces. If I had a nickel for every man named Neil I fancied, I'd have 2 nickels, insert the rest of the joke here. But man, am I beefing with you for axing a Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young appearance in this film. Sea of Madness is a weird one. Yes, they did play it at Woodstock, but the recording here came from their gig at the Fillmore East. Neil wrote this song and you can tell. The chords, the drive, the searing electric guitar, it's got everybody knows this is Nowhere Neil written all over it. He sounds great, sings with a real conviction, there's fire in his belly, in All I Need Is Your Sweet, Sweet Lovin'. It feels wrong enjoying this cut more than others that are actually from Woodstock. We're on to the second disc by now, and my god, the Who were troopers. After last week's Redux review of Tommy, I have a whole new appreciation for them. One of the greatest live acts of the 60s, certainly the greatest British one. This was the era of them performing hours-long sets, almost all of their deranged double album rock opera effort Tommy, and their regular repertoire. Not to mention, they were on at the crack of dawn. Raj was exhausted by the end of every set, and you can tell on We're Not Gonna Take It. Nevertheless, they soldier on. But as if powered by Mooney battering away and Pete's lava-hot SG, he gets a second wind. The way he regains his bearings and bellows out, "See me, feel me, touch me, heal me," is stunning. I do wish we had something else from The Who on this soundtrack, something to pair with We're Not Gonna Take It. That song is the finale of a whole rock opera. We need a build-up to experience that triumphant payoff. Even just having Summertime Blues would have helped. That was so much fun. Listening to With a Little Help from My Friends, you just get why Joe Cocker's set made him famous. Holy hell could the guy sing! He sounds haggard, but in a really good way. He does the impossible, injecting a Ringo song with fire and soul. He didn't even need the backing vocals, which are so obviously dubbed in, it's not even funny. I love this arrangement. The stop times are fun. I love that all 7 minutes of it are included on here because Joe's band was spot on and they take this tune to incredible heights. As a whole, I feel the first disc was lackluster. With a Little Help from My Friends injected some life into this thing, which is carried on by a group widely considered to have played one of the weekend's best sets, Santana. The charm of Woodstock is how rough around the edges and off the cuff everybody is. We are improvising all over the place, no one is in tune, people's voices are hanging on for dear life, and suddenly, there's Santana. All in tune, all razor sharp, all perfectly in sync, and doing all that shit on the fly. Forgive my bias, I fucking loved Santana in college. Abraxas was the only record of theirs I had at the time, but it was never off my turntable for long. I don't know what kind of portal these guys opened up with this one, but in an instant on Soul Sacrifice, I'm talking the first 30 seconds, I'm in it. I'm there. This is the immersive experience I have been craving, not the rain, not the crowd chants. For a few minutes there, I'm on the same wavelength as 6 incredibly talented musicians from 55 years ago and the hundreds of thousands they put under their spell. That hypnotic quality, that trance-like state, is what I love about live music, and I so rarely get on a live album. I wish there was more Jefferson Airplane on this iteration of the soundtrack, but I am immensely grateful for the inclusion of Volunteers. It's my favorite song of that set, and I actually prefer the Woodstock recording to the album version. Considering how blasted they all were, you can literally see Paul Kantner's acid kick in during White Rabbit. They were bright, chipper, hard, and sharp. Marty and Grace's voices were always right. Holy hell, Sly and the Family Stone! This is my favorite set of the weekend. I have no idea why we don't give as much love to their set as we do Jimi or Santana or Jefferson Airplane. This medley is substance-fueled funk perfection, hastily slammed out thanks to the winter sports, but not without style. This is so damn fast and hitting every beat so sharp we're getting into hip-hop beat territory. They are chugging away at I Wanna Take You Higher, trumpet gleefully buzzing away. Sly gets the crowd hype. You can feel his aura jumping up from these grooves. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be shouting with 300,000 other people at 4 o'clock in the goddamn morning. Of course, I can't mention Sly and the Family Stone without saying these guys also appeared at the Harlem Cultural Festival dubbed the Black Woodstock. In fact, they were the only group to have played both. Watch this documentary. Listen to this soundtrack. This is really good. Then we have some more John B. Sebastian. Good job, John. Like the Grateful Dead 10 years after and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band were brilliant groups shafted by their circumstances at Woodstock. Love March was far from the best moment of Paul Butterfield's set. I don't know why they included a number from when they were so obviously pooped. And the grand finale of it all, Jimi Hendrix. I have been waiting to talk about Jimi Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner for so long. It's almost been in so many videos, but I cut it. The Woodstock soundtrack was nearly featured on this series 2 years ago, but I cut it from the schedule. I've been waiting for this moment for years, and now I don't think I can do it, because I know this analysis won't be as strong as my analysis of B.O.G's Machine Gun, but I'm gonna try. What made Jimi Hendrix so brilliant was how much he could express through his instrument. A lot of guitarists make you feel a certain way. Very few can make a guitar speak, or sing, or cry. Jimi sent his off to war. His phrasing is just insane. He bends sound into terrifying screams, helpless cries, swamp heat, inescapable body heat. After And the Rocket's Red Glare, he warps feedback into firebombs blazing through the sky. These low buzzes undercut the wails like planes flying over a battlefield. Jimi's mixing the past with the present. War has happened before, it happens now, it will happen over and over again until we do something. With the bombs bursting in air, wanton slashes at the strings take those soaring heights and punt them down. Every blast taking chunks out of the earth, the sound curdles like spilled blood mixed with mud, the fumes of spilled fuel. It's the stench of death. The most chilling moment of Jimi's Star-Spangled Banner doesn't appear in the original cut of the film, but it does in my cut. My best friend is from Ireland. He heard Jimi's Star-Spangled Banner for the first time earlier this week, and I had to explain this bit of the solo to him. After Jimi plays what would be gave proof through the night that our flag was still there, he sneaks in a few bars of taps. Taps is a bugle tune played at soldiers' funerals. Cutting the national anthem with taps is a ballsy move, blasphemous according to some, but against everything we've heard before. The statement is clear as fucking day. The unsung hero of this performance is experienced drummer Mitch Mitchell, his relentless pummeling away in a sonic assault not unlike gunfire. We can't forget Jimi's army buddy Billy Cox was up there on that stage with him. Jimi's Star-Spangled Banner is brilliant because he took the horror Americans felt watching war go down on TV for the very first time and funneled it all into his playing. Purple Haze is here too, but really, how could you ever follow that up? That's just the victory lap. Looking back at my big rock and roll awakening about half a decade ago, the one thing I missed was the sense of community the Woodstock kids had. They were all my age once upon a time, buying the same records I am, loving the artists I do. The soundtrack doesn't capture that experience. The film almost does. 55 years later, why are people still in love with Woodstock? Easy. It can never happen again. It was a miracle it happened in the first place, an off-the-cuff music festival that becomes a free show when 10 times the projected crowd showed up. Held on a farm, no less, and it rained and rained for days on end. That's a recipe for disaster. But somehow, it worked. Altamont tried to be the Woodstock of the West. It ended terribly. The same thing almost happened at Isle of Wight 1970. Big festivals like this got harder and harder to organize, and it's gotten harder to keep people safe. That last point is almost too relevant, because late last night, as of me filming this, Austrian authorities thwarted a terrorist attack at a Taylor Swift concert. One can't help but think of the potential outcome had this plot not been discovered. It might have played out like the attack at Ariana Grande's Manchester show about 7 years ago. At the end of the day, concert tickets are refundable. People aren't. The only way I can even think to round out this episode is to circle back to something I said in the film review. Things were never quite as good for the hippies after Woodstock. First, the 68 DNC, then the horrific Tate LaBianca murders the week before that effectively ended the Laurel Canyon spirit. And finally, Altamont. The Garden of Earthly Delights descended into hell. With this in mind, and the double-edged sword of retrospect in my hands, I feel sad watching Woodstock. Hearing Woodstock, too. I can't help but wonder what became of all those thousands of people. Did they assimilate into real life? Cut their hair and get big boy jobs? Did they evaporate with the rain to live their free-loving dreamland forever? How many of those boys couldn't dodge the draft? How many went to Vietnam and came home in a box? Does their heaven look like Woodstock? It wasn't perfect. None of the 60s counterculture was. Historically, I've been quite critical of the hippies. They wasted such huge potential by having no clear-cut goals. Imagine being able to organize like that, but having nothing to organize for besides a dream. But for 4 days, on some farm in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, it was pretty close. It wasn't just a festival, it was a living, breathing thing. A city, a society, at least 2 people died, possibly 1 born, thousands injured, but none by each other's hand. Just peace, love, music, and a dream. Though it's faded with each passing year, 55 years later, Woodstock is still alive. Because of the efforts of so many men and women, Woodstock isn't just a festival. It's history. Not just American history, human history. Permanently affixed in the cosmic ether, somewhere beyond the veil between what is here and what is not. For me, if I make it to heaven anyway, heaven is the Grandy Ballroom in 1968. My heaven is with the incense and the psychedelic light show, beautiful men, and music louder than hell. But for those kids who dared dream of flower power over fire power, Woodstock is their stinky, smelly, muddy, freewheeling, beautiful heaven. I once said peace and love is dead, now I'm not so sure. Is it really the smell of rain outside? Or is it the earthy smell of those souls? My personal favorites off this one are the Fix and to Die Rag, with a little help from my friends, Soul Sacrifice, Volunteers, the Sly and the Family Stone medley, and the Star Spangled Banner. If you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That is part 1 of the Vinyl Monday Woodstock mini-series 2.0. That's fucking Woodstock. What do you think of this soundtrack? What do you think of the film? What do you think of Woodstock? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. If you were there at any point that weekend, please tell your stories in these comments. Despite what some guy has to say, Your experience matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11, and a new episode of my podcast, The Dolls Podcast, every other Friday. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye! Or peace.